Chapter 37. Cam. While Cam thought about Darian's legitimate question, he removed his Realtree pattern John Deere ball cap and scratched his head. "I'm winging this, man," he whispered with a hoarse chuckle. "Sort of figured. And yet you came anyway. I question your judgment." The two men were silent for a moment after their brief exchange before Cam quickly got to his feet and moved forward. When they came to Millbrae Road, they stopped for a quick security check, then moved across the road and turned east. Their intention was to cross over Highway 101 in a remote area between Rohnert Park and Santa Rosa by using a smallish waterway that ran underneath the highway. If the KPA were using APCs to control travel along Highway 101, he and Darian would be able to pass right underneath the blocking force and continue on in an easterly direction, undetected. The only issue with the waterway was that it was a mud-banked, creek-type channel until it neared the highway. Closer to the highway, county or city engineers had transformed the channel into a concrete aqueduct in order to control erosion and flooding near the main roadways. Based on his memories from when he and his brother were younger, Darian was of the opinion that once they were down in the concrete aqueduct, the cement walls would be too high to climb out of without the help of ladders or ropes. Their second hardship was that, even in California, the temperatures midway through November were getting chillier than a person would care to be out in after dark, and they were about to slosh through 50 to 60-degree water with no real way to dry out afterward other than wait for daylight and pray there was no cloud cover. Having no real choice in the matter, Cam led Darian forward along the creek's slippery bank for as far as he could go before they were no longer able to negotiate the steep, muddy sides of the creek. When they reached the spot where the channel of water snaked under Millbrae Road from the south, then curled back to the east, they stood on the muddy shore, looking into the brackish waters. If he'd been back home in Tennessee, Cam would have been hesitant to wade into the waters like that for fear of running into a water moccasin. California was too cold right now for much in the way of snakes to be out, and even the rattlesnakes were probably holed up for the winter. With his rifle held out high to his side, he slipped into the freezing cold waters. He waded deeper and felt his feet sink into the deep mud lining the bottom of the waterway. As the water neared his belt line, Cam gasped out loud. A moment later, he heard the same reaction from Darian when the younger man reached the waist-deep waters. Together, they pushed slowly and silently towards the highway like two midnight wraiths, their torsos gliding above the murky waters of the channel. Reaching the concrete aqueduct portion of the channel, both men felt boxed in as they drove deeper up the aqueduct. The soft clang of metal on metal froze both men in the water. Cam's rifle was up, sweeping for threats, as was Darian's, but the sound subsided. Of course, thought Cam. They'd chosen this area because it was south of Santa Rosa, and the KPA had probably done the same. That they would want to control travel before it ever reached the city made perfect sense, and he internally kicked himself for not thinking of it before now. Standing in waist-deep water, with the enemy danger close, and in possession of the high ground, made Cam sick to his stomach. After a moment's deliberation, he decided to push forward, walking quite literally right under the noses of his enemy. A glance behind him assured him that Darian was following, and together the men crept toward the highway until they were underneath the gigantic concrete edifice. Panicked thoughts raced through Cam's mind as he reached the halfway point. What if a bum was under the bridge and called out to them? The more he thought about possible outcomes, the less worried he became. If a bum called out in English, there was little chance the KPA soldiers would understand and would probably just shoot the poor soul who'd called out. When they reached the far side without incident, Cam felt as though he'd been put through the tension wringer all the same. When the concrete ended and gave way to natural muddy banks again, Cam climbed out of the water and realized for the first time since he'd entered how cold he felt. Darian crawled up next to him, and together they knelt, shivering in the wet, soupy muck along the banks of a channel that smelled like water wasn't the only thing running between its banks. "We can't stop until the sun comes up," Cam ground out through quivering blue lips and chattering teeth. Darian bobbed his head. "I'd like to see where they're at back there. You good with that?" Darian gave a heave of his shivering shoulders, which told Cam he was too cold to care what they did. Without waiting for Darian to change his mind, he crossed the channel and climbed up the slippery northern bank of the creek. He waited 2 minutes before moving in a crouched run across the grassy area to the edge of a nearby industrial complex. The complex, like most others across the country, was fenced off with a high chain-link barrier topped with 3 strands of wicked-looking barbed wire. The strands were strung across a 45-degree barbed wire arm that extended outward from the property, intended to keep trespassers out. Cam studied the troublesome snare at the top of the fence, then pulled a set of Klein lineman wire cutters from his backpack. His hands were cold enough to make handling the cutters difficult as he labored to open the tool's hardened cutting knives and shove them over the first link of the fencing. The pop that followed the pressure he applied to the cutter's handles shot waves of pain through his nearly frozen knuckle joints. He squeezed his eyes shut as he repeated the process, painfully working to open a slit in the fence large enough for him and Darian to move through. The process of cutting was louder and took longer than either man would have guessed possible, but Cam finally stowed the cutters and crawled through the opening. Once inside, the 2 men could move faster without making much noise on the paved surface of the complex. A frontage road paralleled the highway, and an on-ramp for the southbound lanes connected to it. That's what Cam aimed for. Adolescent redwood trees grew alongside the on-ramp, right up to the point where it crossed over all north and southbound lanes. Cam used the coniferous evergreens to shield their approach as he led Darian across the frontage road and up the on-ramps. The cold that threatened to turn him hypothermic seemed to be temporarily held at bay as he jogged up the overpass, his blood pumping hard from a mixture of fear and excitement brought on by a healthy dose of adrenaline. Halfway up the ramp, they stopped and crouched low, using the redwood trees as concealment from any prying eyes on the highway. Below them, Cam could see a single APC parked across the northbound lanes, its nose pointing west toward the southbound lanes. At such close range, both Cam and Darian could hear the occasional clank or scuffing of equipment on the interior of the massive APC. The main gun faced south, but Cam wasn't sure which direction the smaller 7.62 millimeter gun faced because of the darkness shrouding most of the vehicle's features. Light suddenly shone from the rear of the vehicle as a KPA soldier pushed the door open and peered out into the black night. After a second, the soldier swung the hatch open and stepped onto the pavement. For the briefest of moments as the soldier's feet landed on the ground and before he swung the latch closed, Cam could see inside the vehicle. In that snapshot, Cam saw one other KPA soldier leaning against the bulkhead, but saw no other men inside. Quickly, he scanned the area all around the vehicle, remembering how many men they'd encountered with the other APC in Petaluma. When he spotted no one else, he went back to watching the soldier who had climbed out and was now setting up and lighting a small stove. Cam watched as the man poured what was likely water into a small pot and set it over the open flame emitted by the stove. The soldier squatted next to the stove, his night vision certainly destroyed by the light of the fire, but he still glanced around, peering into the night, his rifle laid across the tops of his thighs as he tended to the stove. They were roughly 50 yards from the APC and its nighttime tea maker when a thought came to him. It was more an urge than a rational thought, but he felt compelled to make sure Darian would be a willing participant before he went off half-cocked. Once Darian was on board, he figured they could go off half-cocked together. Leaning back so his face nearly touched Darian's, he whispered his impetuous plan. "Let's kill these guys." Darian's jaw dropped, then snapped shut, which told Cam it truly was a madman's plan. He would have agreed a few minutes ago, but the more he worked it out in his mind, the better he thought their chances of success were. Before Darian could argue, Cam shook his head and grabbed the younger man by the shoulder. "This isn't like the other APC. There are only maybe 3 soldiers here, and one is already outside the vehicle." Cam squeezed Darian's shoulder, buying himself a little time to work that out. "Okay, the other guy will probably come out for tea or whatever the hell the dude is cooking. Then we hit them both." "What about the APC?" "It's parked all sideways and won't be able to maneuver on us easily. Plus, If there is only one guy left, he has to drive, so no one will be shooting at us. As soon as I crack-a-lack the first two, I'll run down there, jump in the back, and finish off the driver. Dude left the back door open." Darian rocked back on his heels, studying Cam's serious face in the low light. "Why are we doing this? Won't it make him more alert when you try to get your wife?" Cam's face screwed into a tight knot of frustration. "That's one way of looking at it," he whispered. "Or there will be 3 fewer shitheads trying to kill me when that time comes." He could almost see the thoughts flitting through Darian's mind. He knew Cam wasn't going to relent and was probably telling himself that if Rostam had been the one taken or killed, he'd be killing every single Korean he could put in his sights too. While Darian made up his mind, Cam shot a look back at the APC. The driver was compromised in the manner he'd parked, and he wouldn't be able to fire any of the weapon systems while trying to move the vehicle, but he would almost certainly be able to make a radio call. "Damn it," Cam muttered under his breath. "What?" Darian asked, wondering what unthinkable thing his crazy partner had just thought of. "The radio," Cam whispered. "If we do this, it's got to be fast, and we need to beat feet immediately afterwards." "Can't you just shoot off their antenna?" Darian remarked innocently. Cam released Darian's shoulder and fumbled with his binoculars. Finding them, he brought the optics to his eyes and studied the outline of the hulking armored vehicle below. On top, slightly to the rear of the main gun, was a long whip-type antenna. He didn't see any sign of other communication-enhancing devices, but also knew antennas could be small enough to hold in one's hand. Slowly, he replaced his binoculars, then began unstrapping the sniper rifle from his pack while Darian watched with more than a little curiosity. "Are you going to shoot it off?" Darian asked when Cam had the rifle in hand. "I think I am," Cam breathed. He brought the rifle to his shoulder and peered through the scope. He picked up the rear of the APC and tracked the outline of the vehicle to the antenna. With the scope set at 10 power, he could see clearly. Cam held the rifle steady for a moment, then lowered the heavy weapon. "Can you smoke the 2 guys if they're just hanging out down there and not shooting back when we start this party?" Darian nodded, remembering how quickly the Green Berets decimated the KPA Special Forces men days earlier. The speed with which the battle started and ended was staggering, considering the loss of life incurred by both the North Koreans and the Americans. "Okay, we wait for the second guy to get out. I'll call out a countdown from 3, and we both shoot on what would have been 0, only I won't be saying it." He stared hard at Darian, waiting to see the understanding in his partner's eyes. When he was convinced Darian understood, he continued, "I'll drop this rifle right here, and it's up to you to take it if something happens to me. Otherwise, I need you to cover me from up here in case I miscounted how many of these guys are really down there." Again, Darian nodded. "Good. Be ready," Cam warned. Both men lay shivering on the cold, hard pavement, sighting their weapons between the stanchions holding the W-beam barrier aloft along the edges of the on-ramp. 10 minutes later, the KPA soldier who crouched at the fire stood and walked the short distance to the APC's rear hatch. He rapped on it 3 times. Without waiting for a response, the man returned to the stove and removed the small pot, which was emitting steam even the 2 ambushers could see. "Get ready," Cam breathed, feeling his body transition into a state of readiness few, if any civilians, would ever know or understand. "I got him, Cam," Darian whispered back. 30 seconds later, the rear hatch opened and 2 soldiers crawled out, pausing to stretch their arms and legs at the rear of the APC. One man appeared to have been awakened for the middle of the night tea party. He rubbed his eyes before glancing around and then stretching again. When the 3rd man came out after the 2nd man, Cam literally thought, "Oh, goody." For a moment, he pondered foregoing taking out the antenna and helping Darian instead, but told himself to stick to the plan in the event there was a 4th man inside the APC who could call in backup. As the KPA soldiers squatted in a small half circle, waiting for the tea to brew, Cam's fingers slid into the trigger well of the Gunworks rifle. 3, 2, 1. And then the quietness of the night was obliterated by the sound of the unsuppressed rifle fire. Cam rolled off the gunworks rifle and brought his own AR into action, just in time to see the second KPA soldier pitch headlong into the still-burning stove next to the first soldier who lay on his side. A pool of flames washed out across the pavement as the stove's fuel spilled, caught fire, and burned. He picked up the third man just as the soldier launched to his feet, desperately searching for the cause of his comrade's demise. Before the man's instinctive reaction to spin and face the threat was completed, Cam and Darian each fired 3 or 4 rounds into the flailing soldier's body. He fell back, caught himself on the side of the APC, looked like he might make a run for it, then slid down the side of the massive vehicle. His rifle dropped across his lap, looking almost staged. Before Darian could draw a breath, Cam was halfway to the APC, weapon up, moving with speed and intent. Cam fired on the third man as he tried to get to his feet, reaching for his dropped rifle. The man caught one of the 2 rounds and crumpled as Cam sped down the sloped grade. He ran at breakneck speed down the embankment, slipped once, skidding on his ass, then regained his footing just as he reached the bottom of the incline, using his momentum to pop back to his feet. Up and running now, he offset himself from the APC's rear hatch as he closed with the armored beast. The engine wasn't running and hadn't turned over after the shooting. Not that a great amount of time had passed since he'd put the 3 KPA soldiers to sleep, but Cam was registering it all now. He reached the side of the rear hatch and took a moment to shoot all 3 KPA soldiers from where he was at, making certain none of them came back to life to shoot him in the back. He didn't have time to disarm and search the men, so shooting them was his next best option, and possibly the best option overall, considering they'd taken his family and were doing their best to take his country. Certain the downed KPA men were no longer a problem, Cam used his muzzle to push the slightly ajar rear hatch all the way open. Slowly, he pied the inside of the vehicle off, easing an inch at a time across the front of the opening, weapon raised, until he'd seen the entire interior and was positive no one was inside. "Stay there and cover me!" Cam shouted from the back of the vehicle. There was no use whispering now. Their unmuted gunfire had let the proverbial cat out of the bag to their presence and their intentions. Poking his head inside, he searched for anything he could take and was rewarded by the sight of a Chinese-made RPG-7 leaning against an interior wall along with 2 satchels of munitions. He reached in and grabbed it all, dragging it out and laying it on the ground next to his feet. He wanted to search the entire APC. Hell, he wanted to start it, drive it out of the area, and hide it until Mike and Tim returned to help him rescue Jen and the kids. But he wasn't sure if his rifle fire had attracted other units in the area. If it had, he didn't have time to learn the nuances of driving the Chinese-made APC. Quickly, he slung the munitions over his shoulder, grabbed the launching tube, and scrambled back up the embankment, heading back to Darian. "Hold up one!" Cam hollered as Darian stood, poised to run. At the top of the on-ramp, Cam cast a worried look north, but didn't see any lights headed their way. As dark as the world had become, lights were about the easiest thing to spot now. The moment he cleared the guardrail barrier, he dropped everything, including his rifle. He pulled a single munition from a satchel and loaded the launcher, took 15 seconds to refamiliarize himself with the weapon, then pulled it into place on his right shoulder. He'd fired the exact weapon in the Middle East more times than he could remember, and as the tube fell into place and the sights aligned with his eye, it all came rushing back. "Backblast clear!" he yelled, then realized Darian wouldn't know what that meant. "Get out from behind this thing! It'll kill you if you're behind it!" Darian scurried off to one side and covered his ears as Cam let loose the rocket. The warhead hissed across a short distance and slammed through the open hatch and inside the APC, causing significant damage to the armored vehicle. The hatches on the top of the vehicle blew open, and fire burst out like angry torches from several other openings on the sides and top of the stricken APC. Its carapace-like armor was intended to protect the vehicle from munition strikes on the APC's exterior, not from the interior. Cam handed the tube to Darian and picked up the gunworks rifle. Can you grab half the munitions for this thing? Darian did so, and together the duo hurried the best they could down the on-ramp, disappearing into the night like two overloaded wraiths.